everyone.
It's a good place to be.
Good morning. Okay, please rise. All right, actually, we are going to start by having Regent Young acknowledge some of our guests. Do you want to do it at the end? Because it's set up in the beginning.
Okay.
We'll just acknowledge them and then we can do it again.
Fine, I will do that. Good morning.
Good morning.
And as you can tell, I do what I'm told.
Even at home.
That's right. All right, Joe.
That was good.
Okay. I would like to, today's a very important day for the New York State Board of Regents. It's an important day for New York State history, and a part of that is the recognition of the life's work of Dr. Kenneth Clark. And as all of you know, Dr. Clark, along with his wife, established the Northside Center for Child Development in Harlem. And we have with us today the current Executive Director and CEO of the Northside Center, Dr. Thelma Dye. She is accompanied by her husband, Carlton Holmes.
All right, so please be seated. We're going to switch the moment of reflection, do it a little differently. For our first order of business, I also like to acknowledge we will have some of our legislators with us this morning. We also have the New York State PTA members. We have other guests with us, so welcome. And to commemorate Black History Month, 7 of our colleagues will share after Regent Johnson. I think you're going to do an opening, which will serve as a reflection as well as opening to the reflections of our very own colleagues. Regent Johnson.
Thank you very much, Chancellor, and good morning to everyone.
Good morning. Morning.
In the United States, Canada, United Kingdom, Germany, and Netherlands, in all of these countries, February is formally designated Black History Month. I'm going to insert a statement that I'm going to repeat several times. Black History Month is American history. We celebrate, commemorate, and reflect on the meaning and purpose of this month. A little history: Carter G. Woodson, a Harvard-trained African-American historian, launched the study of African-American history in 1915. 11 years later, Negro History Week was launched. By the way, I remember that in school. And in 1976, President Gerald Ford designated the month of February Black History Month. And every U.S. president since that time, except for the current one, has officially redesignated February Black History Month. This morning, the members of the New York State Board of Regents and the State Education Department paused to reflect on the meaning, intent, and significance of Black History Month. I want to thank the members of the Cultural Education Department under the leadership of Mark Shaman for the support they undertook. They compiled a compendium, which is available, of events around the state. There was a poster exhibit in the State Museum, and the monthly Archive magazine features the story of the Green Book, a book that defined for African Americans where it was safe to travel when one traveled south. Our reflections will begin with a short video. I want to caution you, it is history, not entertainment. It offers highlights of the African American journey. It does not tell the entire story. It offers points in time. At the conclusion of the video presentation, several members of this board will reflect on our presence in America and offer observations on how the color of our skin has defined our moral and spiritual journey. There's a rich history of the African culture, our lives mattered long before the Middle Passage, the ships that brought Africans to the Western Hemisphere. Our history descends from the African diaspora. It is global and spans millennia. In 1619, that's 400 years ago, blacks arrived in the Western Hemisphere. Let me correct some mistakes people make. We did not come as indentured servants. We came as involuntary immigrants to this country. We did not come with the anticipation of a better life. We came as slaves. I am the great-great-grandchild of Eliza. When I first stepped on African soil, I knew the continent was my ancestral home. 2019 marks the 400th anniversary of the arrival of 19 enslaved Africans to the shores of the Western Hemisphere. As I said before, this video does not tell the entire narrative, nor does it offer all the highlights of the contributions and challenges we continue to experience. In 2019, slavery's aftermath hovers in deep and awful, profoundly disturbing ways over race relations in America. Racial disenfranchisement continues, as does voter suppression, economic exclusion, and overrepresentation of black children attending poorly resourced schools. Our journey continues to reflect this complex juxtaposition of both racial progress alongside of racial tragedies. Our history includes both a celebration of famous black trailblazers who persevered against odds, while our history also reflects the reality of black everyday life. Black folk whose courage, resilience, and intelligence continues to guide the transformation from slavery to freedom, and in that struggle continues to reimagine American democracy, a concept still under construction. I'm going to end with a statement from probably one of the most famous African Americans in history, who also was the first African American to be on a president's cabinet, and that is Frederick Douglass. But I do want to suggest to you that my comments come from reviewing the website of the National Museum for African American History and Culture, and I encourage you all to visit that website. It's a digital museum available wherever you are on this planet. Frederick Douglass. Some know the value of education by having it. I know its value by not having it. And now we will turn to the video.
One day, when the glory comes, it will be ours, it will be ours. Oh, one day, when the war is won, we will be sure, we will be sure. Oh, glory, glory, oh, glory. Glory. Hands to the heavens, no man, no weapon. Formed against, yes, glory is destined. Everyday women and men become legends. Sins that go against our skin become blessings. The movement is a rhythm to us. Freedom is like religion to us. Justice is juxtaposition in us. Justice for all, just ain't specific enough. One son died, the spirit is revisiting us. True and living in us. Resistance is us. That's why Rosa sat on the bus. That's why we walk through Ferguson with our hands up. When it go down, we woman and man up. They say stay down, and we stand up. Shots be on the ground, the camera panned up. King pointed to the mountaintop, and we ran up. One day, when the glory comes, it will be ours, it will be ours. Oh, one day, when the war is won,
I'm broken down and tired of living life on the merry-go-round. And you can't find a fighter, but I see it in you, so we gon' walk it out. Ooh, mountains, we gon' walk it out. And ooh, mountains.
acknowledge the presence of our very own Honorable Majority Leader Andrea Stewart Cousins. And thank you and congratulations for all you do for all children and all staff people that are engaged in this endeavor. Thank you. And I am going to put you on the spot as soon as we're done with this part of it and ask you to address, thank you.
We have an order. We have an order. It starts with Regina.
Thank you. And thank you for the video. I was born only a few years after the Loving decision. And I often wonder what my personal experience would have been like if I had been born not in New York City, which was where I was born and raised, but in North Carolina, where my father's family was from. And it's a very rural area. It's Richmond County. It's actually, if you're following national politics, it's right in the middle of that 9th congressional district, which is under investigation for disenfranchisement of black voters in the last election. And even today, it is an area where even today the population is only about 50,000 people, which is half the size of the population of the North Country, region of Oak Creek. So very rural area. And, my father and some of his siblings came up here in search of better opportunity in the 60s. I have been involved in a genealogy project the last handful of months, did my ancestry DNA, and I've reconnected with some long-lost relatives. And I've been able to build a family tree going all the way back to my 3rd great-grandfather on that side, a man by the name of Rufus Bennett. And he was born, and he lived, and he worked the land, as many Southern blacks did in his day, and he had a family, and he died in Richmond County, North Carolina. And when I found his death certificate, so the death certificate lays out the name, the age, approximate age, cause of death, and there's a space for the mother's name, space for the father's name. And it really took the wind out of my sails to see that those spaces were marked with these big, thick X's. It was like an X, an X. And it was like the state where he was born and lived and worked, had a family and died, did not care to know where he came from. So when I think about that, and I think about the enormous responsibility that we have on this board and the department, we are responsible for the collective memory and the history of the state of New York, and this reinforces that, and I will pledge to be mindful of that as we continue our work. So thank you.
Thank you, Regina.
Good morning, everyone. The picture that you're going to see shortly on the areas. He just participated in a reenactment of the Birmingham merchants' unfair treatment of African Americans there in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963. We African Americans have taken it upon ourselves, since we do not have in many curriculums across the country African American history. So in this picture here, Cameron, along with a lot of other children, reenacted what happened in 1963 when 4,000 children took to the streets of Birmingham, Alabama to protest segregation, racism, and the unfair treatment of their relatives there in Birmingham. He learned about the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church, where 4 African American young women perished in that bombing. A scholarship is given every year by the Jack and Jill organization, which he is part of. And we've taken it upon ourselves, many organizations, not only Jack and Jill, but many other organizations, to fill that deficit that we are not filling in public education, to educate our children about the trials and tribulations that many people went through, many people. In 1963, of those 4,000 children that participated in that march, many of them were jailed. And these were elementary kids, these were high school kids. Many of them were jailed. We want to continue the legacy of so many people who've done so much for this country. We're going to continue, I hope, through all the organizations that have an African American base, to educate our children. We can't rely on public education. We have to educate Cameron and all of his little friends about the contributions that were made. This morning is a special morning for me because I'm going to say something and ask you, how many of you in this room like potato chips? I should ask you how many of you don't like potato chips? That should be the question. Well, this potato chip was invented by an African American male who lives 45 minutes from here in Saratoga Springs. His name is Mr. Crum. And he invented this potato chip. And when I told some young people in an audience there in Buffalo, where I live, about this, they were just taken back because every time now, because I don't look at the potato chip the same way that I used to look at it, calories, I think of a piece of African American history. So now when you pick up a potato chip, you'll think about Mr. Crum, who lived not far from here, but a piece of African American history. Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So in 2016, I was at home on a given day, minding my own business. And I was watching a program, I believe, and I've heard disparaging remarks before in my life about African Americans, but on this particular day, someone said something that I'd heard before, and it was basically, if you don't like what's going on in America, why don't you go back to Africa? And for some reason, my ancestors rose up and answered that question, and I just began to write it down. And this is what they said. Find time to tell me to go back to Africa. After I fought on all your wars, suckled your babies, shined your shoes, been raped and beaten and been your strange fruit. Find time to tell me to go back to Africa. Find time to tell me to go back to Africa when you owe me $50 gazillion in back wages, in education, housing, goods, services, music royalties, acting roles, a simple apology. Find time to tell me to go back to Africa when you love to brown your skin in the sun to look like me, dread your hair, imitate my music, jazz, rock and roll, gospel. Where's the good news? And the blues? Got plenty of the blues. Find time to tell me to go back to Africa when you tried to erase my culture, but now you got my dance steps. Dress like me, talk like me, walk like me. Find time. You abused me, defamed me, misrepresent me, disenfranchise me, kill my young. But you will never destroy me because I am a child of the survivors. Those who made the trip from Africa, stacked 20 deep, washed in stench, starved, beaten, raped, stomped, scared, but who lived. I am a child of the survivors who did not quit, die from disease, jump overboard, or commit suicide on board. A child of the survivors who made it to America only to be subjected to slavery, more rapes, beatings, degradation, maiming, murder, and other assorted horrors. I live because my ancestors were made of the strongest stuff on earth, and therefore so am I. You will never destroy me, no matter how many times you try. And oh, how many times you have tried. Slavery, Jim Crow, segregation, integration, poverty, drugs, guns, politics, religion, prison, white privilege, institutional racism, no education, miseducation. And yet I stand because you bred me into a Tuskegee Airman, a Malcolm, a Medgar, a Martin, an Oprah, a Maya, a Serena, a LeBron, and Ida Mae. Do what you will. But like the mystical bird, the phoenix, I will rise from the ashes.
All right.
Because I am a descendant of the survivors. Find time to tell me to go back to Africa.
Madam Chancellor, colleagues, my mother's grandmother was named Meter Collins Thomas, and she lived from 1895 to 1945 in Clinch County, Georgia. And my mother spent her early years growing up in her grandmother's home. My mother's early memories center around her mother and grandmother, and her grandmother's father, the Reverend John Collins, who lived in that same multi-generational home until he died in 1950 at the ripe old age of 103. As a result, the living memory of my maternal line reaches beyond sharecropping and emancipation and gives an honest account of life back in them dark days. One thing that had not survived in our family's oral history is a fact I came across through research in a state archive. My mother's response to this discovery was that she didn't talk about it because it was inconsequential. She thought it was just ordinary. And that fact came through a newspaper clipping that I found that was printed in the late 1930s in the Southern newspaper's news section entitled Among Our Colored People. And that news clipping reported that an out-of-town family was traveling to Florida and was staying in the home of my great-grandmother. And it was one of several articles that I found that documented that my mom's grandmother's house was part of a different kind of underground railroad. Was something that my mother just never talked about, but my great-grandmother's house was a place where African-American travelers could find safety while they traveled to visit family down south. And I share this with you, and I'm very thankful that the Chancellor and Regent Johnson thought of this opportunity for reflection, because I want you to know that I believe that document-based query and learning how to conduct scholarly research is not just something we ought to have as part of the Regent standards. I think it's essential for people knowing how to learn and for young people having certainty of who they are and from where they come. I want to make the point that Black history is American history, and it is the history of our families. And I just want to say that Black history is all of our history. And I want to say this because I want to stress that history is made up of ordinary people doing ordinary things that may appear to their children to be inconsequential, but appear to their grandchildren and to a nation as having significance. And that allows me to close. I limited myself to 400 words, and I'm going to close right where Regent Johnson opened. And that's in the renewed discovery of and interest in Mr. Green's Green Book, and in the treasure that is our New York State Archives. There was a power in the moment when I found Reverend Collins's picture in his state archives and showed it to my mother. And she said, "That's Pop." We have so much to do to unleash more of that power by bringing the vastness of our archives and our libraries like the Schomburg and museums like the FDR House more directly into our state schools and in a more perfect union with what's going on in our state's classrooms. But I assure you that if we do, we will be able to sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us, a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. And I'll yield the floor to the Vice Chancellor and to Regent Young, facing the rising sun of this new day begun, with the confidence that we can march on until victory is won.
You know, I still have the thoughts of the video in my mind. I commend all of you for sharing your thoughts here today. And I especially commend you, Regent Johnson, for reminding us of the importance of this day. It's hard to watch that video without feeling the full spectrum of emotions, from sadness and anger to outrage to joy and inspiration. And that's the story of the Black American. When we talk about Black History Month, we talk about a time for celebration and really a paying of respect. That's what the month is all about. And as Regent Norwood just mentioned, it's American history. It's a time for all of us to share in. Black history is American history. When we talk about Black history, we sometimes forget that the black man didn't come into existence in American slavery. The black man existed for century upon century upon century before that. The richer, deeper part of Black history is not told. Sadly, it's not known even by most Black Americans. We need to find a way to tell that story. And we need to find a way to celebrate the achievements of the black man and woman in America. When we think about the importance of history, we sometimes ask the question, well, why do we even tell it? Let's be reminded that the greater part of American history, the black man was denied even knowing his culture and her culture, was denied the full appreciation of who we are. You have to know history to know fully who you are and to know fully where you came from and, more importantly, where you need to go to be a true success in this world. Lonnie Bunch said, who was the founding director of the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, he said, the struggles of the past teach us all about the present. That's a simple statement, but it's well said. To appreciate history, we have to look at the entirety of it. As the video presented, the ugly parts, the parts that we laugh and share joy in, that's history. The good and the bad. When we look back as far as we can to observe blacks in America, we see a picture of suffering, hardship, inhumane treatment, degradation, and indignities of the worst kind. From there we can travel the spectrum. We see hardships all along the way, as the video showed by presenting a timeline. Some could look at that picture as one presenting despair. I choose not to. I look at it as a picture of success, tremendous success, perseverance, grit, determination, the I will not be denied attitude that carried the black man to where we are today. When I say black man, of course I'm talking about the entirety of the black race. Anyone who can beat the odds of slavery, Jim Crow, the many inequities the African American has faced is a true champion, a tremendous success and success story. I stand here today upon the shoulders of all those champions. If it wasn't for those who came before me who did the true heavy lifting, I wouldn't be here today. I wouldn't have been able to take advantage of life's opportunities. I reap the benefits of the great suffering and hardship endured by those so that I could have the opportunities that I've enjoyed. I'm thankful for that. We are inspired by our history. All great achievements need the catalyst of inspiration. Knowing those that have suffered such indignities before me inspires me to strive harder and achieve more for the benefits of those who will come after me. I'm indebted. Those that made it all possible are the true champions, including many that we'll never know by name. The vast majority will never know who they are, will never find where they're buried. To each of those men and women, I say thank you, I salute you, and as the song says, I rise up.
Thank you, Vice Chair. I know that our majority leader has to leave, so I'm going to ask her to come up and just to let her know that right after this, we're going to ask Regent Young to do his reflection, and also one of our very own honoring and acknowledging our very own Regent Kenneth Clark.
Yeah.
So we're going to be doing that right after.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rosa, and it's just really good to be here and to be part of this program that takes so deeply the meaning of Black history and takes a moment to not only reflect, but I know in your deliberations understand the responsibility that you have to recreate what we can and must do to educate. We're educators, and it is a responsibility to take what we've seen, what we know, and to move forward. I was looking at this film, and it was just incredibly moving, and I thank you, my own Regent Johnson, for inviting me here. I grew up in the 60s, but when I saw those black soldiers, it just struck me. My dad was a World War II veteran, Purple Heart, Bronze Star, served with valor, and he served in the segregated army. Every time we saw World War II movies, it was always white people fighting. Why? Because it was a segregated army. Our story was not important. And when my dad came home, he came back to a segregated country that did not allow him to take advantage of the GI Bill, did not allow him to purchase a home. Public housing was the option and the alternative. We grew up there. Public education was our only road. We took advantage. My mother, I always say, she wanted to be a lawyer. That was out of the question. She typed 100 words a minute, and being in a corporation was out of the question for her, too. So growing up in the North, I believed that we were just fine because my family told me so. And we had housing from government, we had education from government, and we could vote, and I could sit on in a counter. And yet, the opportunities, the progress, the reality was so sweetly masked. But here I am, with you, with an opportunity to educate, to build on that history, not of sorrow, not of sadness, all that pain we know. But here we are. We survive. We thrive. We show that the dream is reality if we make it so. But we have to educate. This is ground zero for our future, for redeeming our past. I'm so happy that I am with so many people who clearly understand what our mission is and clearly are committed with me, my legislative colleagues. I mean, we have a majority of people in both houses that understand that we got to get this education piece right. And so that our reflections will be reflections, but our present and future will be one of hope and redemption of the humanity of America. Thank you.
Thank you. I also would like to acknowledge Joanne Simon. A member of the Assembly from Brooklyn, and I know that Regent Cashin is very proud that she's here with us today. So I do want to continue, and before we do, I just want to say I want to thank both Majority Leader for her leadership, and also I know that our speaker, Carl Hastie, is not with us today, but is with us today in spirit, knowing that our work is extremely important to his leadership as well. On that note, we turn it back to Virginia.
Sure, thank you. On the way over this morning, someone reminded me that I was the closer, so I'll try to do that. I'll give that some significance. It is not wrong to go back for that which you have forgotten. An accurate reading of history would tell us that the enslaved Africans that were brought to this land were taken from their indigenous country, representing Senegal, Gambia, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, and Ghana. And the Akan people of Ghana have an ancestral word that they use, and some of you may have heard it before, Sankofa. San means to return, Ko means to go, and Fa, to look, to seek, and to take. It's symbolized by a mythical bird. And you can see that the bird's feet are firmly planted going forward, but the head is turned to the back to represent that in order to protect the egg, the future, as you go forward, you can never forget your past. Right? So it's very significant that we're here today and we have these reflections, because it is extremely important of being able to go back and reclaim the past so that you can move forward, so that we can understand why and how we came to be who we are today. My grandmother once told me, and it's interesting, she did it out of context. And she said to me that, you know, Lester, there's something about where we've come from that we need to hold on to as we go someplace else. And throughout my life, I always thought about what that meant. And what I realized, what she was saying to me, is that the first thing is, sometimes we could get full of ourselves and we think our accomplishments are just ours. And we don't recognize that there are, some people refer to it as bridges. Other people talk about standing on the shoulders. I actually like to think about it as a bridge, because bridges take you over obstacles. One of the most important bridges in my life, and perhaps anyone who's concerned with the growth and development of children, is the bridge that I would call Dr. Kenneth Bancroft Clark. In fact, I believe that there probably is not a person, an educator, who has contributed more to our understanding of the importance and the connection between our policies, our practices, and the esteem of our children. And in understanding esteem, we all know that a major contributor to esteem is knowing who you are, feeling good about who you are, and where you've come from. And it was Dr. Kenneth Clark that had us focused on that one thing. And so as we talk about, and lots of people give lip service to this concept of equity, I would say to you that it's more than just lip service, that it's more than just a policy, and that when we talk about the importance of equity and the direction of this board to ensure that all young people receive what they are entitled to, so that they can be all that their hopes and dreams want. I would dare say that it started with the connection that Dr. Kenneth Clark made between policy, practice, and the esteem of children, how they feel about themselves. So it is with that in mind that I would like to read the resolution that we have today. But I want to do it in a context. I had the wonderful opportunity over the weekend to speak with Dr. Clark's daughter, Kate Clark Harris. And last night she actually sent an email to me, and I'm not going to read the whole email. That would be inappropriate. But I am going to read 3 sentences. And it's important for my colleagues to hear this. She says, his commitment to the Regents was very, very important to him. For many years, I remember him heading off to the meetings regardless of other demands he had on him or the weather. Chancellor, or the weather he faced on the long drive. So I'll stop there. The University of the State of New York Education Department resolution in recognition of Kenneth Bancroft Clark. New York State Regent Emeritus, Dr. Kenneth B. Clark, was a groundbreaking educator, author, psychologist, and advocate for racial integration. and I would add social justice. Dr. Clark was the first African American elected to the New York State Board of Regents and served with distinction for 20 years from 1966 to 1986. And just think for a moment, he was appointed in 1966, 182 years. It took 182 years for this board to appoint, to have someone who represented African Americans in this country. Over a distinguished career spanning more than 70 years, Dr. Clark's work, together with his wife, Dr. Mamie Phipps Clark, and I would add, we all know that he was the first black to receive a PhD in psychology. Well, Dr. Mamie Phipps Clark was the first black female to receive a PhD from Columbia in psychology. Right? And so we understand that the history of America, while it didn't always portray people of African descent well, it absolutely held absent African American women. Right? But I thought it was important to note that. Together with his wife, Dr. Mamie Phipps Clark, advanced our understanding of developmental psychology and the impact of race-based stereotypes on children's mental health. In the 1940s, the Clarks administered a test that explored the psychological impact of racial segregation on children. When shown black and white dolls, black children who attended segregated schools were more likely than their integrated peers to say black dolls looked bad and the white doll looked nice. When instructed, now show me the doll that most looks like you, many of the black children showed preference for the white doll. In 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court cited the Clark's findings in its decision of Brown versus Board of Education, the landmark case that ended legal racial segregation in America's public schools. A champion of opportunities for poor and disenfranchised, the Clarks founded the Northside Center for Child Development in Harlem in 1946 in response to the community's need for mental health services for low-income African American children. The innovative not-for-profit continues to thrive today under the more than able leadership of Dr. Thelma Dye, who you've met. And I would add that you may recall that when Princess Catherine, Kate Middleton, came to America, she came to New York, the only visitation that she made to a child development center was the Northside Center. Right? So it shows you that not only its significance in this country, but internationally. The innovative not-for-profit continues to thrive today in service of children in need, providing expert mental health education and enrichment programs for thousands of families each year. Dr. Clark was the first African American to earn his doctorate in psychology from Columbia University, the first to gain tenure at the City College of New York, and the first black president of the American Psychological Association. Be it resolved, on this 11th day of February 2019, the Board of Regents honors Regent Emeritus Dr. Kenneth Bancroft Clark's lifetime of service to the people of New York State and the nation. May we continue to draw wisdom and inspiration from his legacy.
Thank you. Before we conclude, I also want to share that Dr. Clark's baton was passed on to Adelaide Sanford. And so we honor her as well for her amazing work. And that baton was passed on to our very own Regent Young. So, and we will see who you pass that baton on to.
Not ready yet.
So, thank you so much for being here today. And we're so honored. Also, before we conclude, and I personally want to thank all the hard work and all the inspirational thoughts and reflections from everyone around the table. The other thing was that Regent Johnson asked if anyone else, before we conclude this morning's ceremony and honoring the all the wonderful things, you know, along with the, as Vice Chancellor said, with the, you know, the pain, sorrow, but joys that have been a part of the history, and the history that belongs as part of the history of this country. So if anybody else would like to join and comment before before we move on, the floor is open. Sure. Yes.
On behalf of Dr. Kenneth Clark and the family and the Board of Directors of Northside Center for Child Development, I'd like to thank you for this honor for Northside, for Dr. Kenneth Clark, and for Mamie Clark. They are legendary, they are important, and I thank you for honoring the history.
Thank you. Regent Reyes.
I want to make a comment as someone born in Puerto Rico of a mother and father whose coming together in a family was a cause of great conflict because of race. If you think of Romeo and Juliet, the Montagues and the Capulets, I have my own version of that in the fact that on my father's side of the family, they did not want him to go out with my mother to become married. I'm 74, and we have made peace as a family over many years. But I know that I would not be here as an educator, as an advocate, as a regent, if it wasn't for the people who showed total love and acceptance of me as I am, starting with my mother. My father being a World War II veteran and who became invalid, and to be brought up and have a desire to teach and to serve and to be encouraged, and at no time told that because of my being Puerto Rican with mixed racial background that I couldn't. And so I thank the people in my life like Dr. Antonia Pantoja, an Afro-Puerto Rican founder of Aspida, Arturo Schomburg, who started the work of collecting all of the stories of all of the African diasporas. Dr. Donald H. Smith, an acolyte of Dr. Sanford, meaning somebody who followed in the tradition of Kenneth Clark, Adelaide Sanford, understanding that people of African descent come from Africa, but they didn't just come in one wave. They came through to South America, through Central America, to the Caribbean. And so the Garifunas of Belize, the Panamanians, the Cubans, the Dominicans, the Venezuelans, and Puerto Ricans who are Afro-Latinos and have made contributions. And I revel in this month because I feel it is a part of my history as well.
Thank you so much. And finally, before we go to the, oh, I'm sorry, I did have, so before you speak, I was going to say, acknowledge that we celebrate Lunar Year, Chinese calendar, so I was also going to acknowledge the fact that it's a happy beginning in terms of Lunar Year. But
thank you very much, Chancellor. While visiting a school in Queens, PS 111, I was given a book by Principal Dion Jagan, and it was very appropriate because it's entitled Little Leaders, Bold Women in Black History. And basically, the book features 40 trailblazing Black women in American history. Little Leaders educates and inspires as it relates true stories of breaking boundaries and achieving beyond expectations. But what struck me was the preface where it says, to all women whose stories are in this book, thank you for being leaders. Thank you for being brave. Thank you for being bold. We are grateful and we are inspired. To all leaders yet to come, big or little, I cannot wait to hear your stories. Mm-hmm. So I thought it was extremely appropriate. So I'll pass this around if you'd like to take a look at it.
Absolutely. Thank you. Regina Ocker?
Yes, I would like to take this opportunity to thank my colleague who's sitting next to me on my right. Sometimes you have to be knocked off dead center and be pushed by someone to recognize something that is so important. And I don't know if it was last year or the year before, but she asked me how the North Country celebrates Martin Luther King Day. I was like speechless because I didn't have a good answer, and I wasn't going to lie. And sitting here listening to all the stories has been incredible because I live on Main Street in Morristown, and it's built on the side of a hill. One street up is a beautiful old stone home where the Underground Railroad went under that, and it's now been closed off for safety reasons, I believe. But I pledge to you I'm going to find out more about that.
Make sure you do.
Well, you've been going to say, you said that many times, so come on up. And if you miss my house, you'll be in the river.
Just for the record, the commissioner asked me if I had recognized the PTA, and yes, in the beginning, we did recognize the PTA, so I just want the record to reflect that we did. So, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, one quick note. The testimonies we heard this morning were incredibly moving to me and reminded me some years ago where I had invited John Lewis to come and talk at my temple. And during the course of that conversation that he had with us, he talked about who we are as a people and how the experience that he had and that the testimonies around the table have had create American history and not, as I think Wade said. And I think we reflect that today when I hear Nancy Pelosi last week said, talking about immigration, this is not who we are. And I think the experience that we have talked about this morning helped to create the kind of morality that this country has. and will continue to have. I know my ancestors came here also after tremendous conflict and being pushed out of their country, and they are immigrant class, as virtually everybody in this room has. But it is the experience of overcoming our history and being part of that history that I think reflects to putting children in cages and reflects to this very day. So I thank my colleagues.
Thank you. So on that note, we're going to now move on to the more technical stuff that we have to do. But this has been an amazing, amazing morning. I think all of us this morning reflected, but not only that, but I know that looking around in terms of the audience, that many of us were in touch with the blackness in us, and the absolutely commitment and opportunity to really fully understand that everyone should be at the table, and that all of our collective sense of peoplehood is extremely important in terms of the contributions. And so, like Luis Reyes, the issue of being Afro-Latina or the African, or the experience of, some of you around this table, I have been very proud to show my dad's picture, because a lot of times people judge you by your phenotype, right? And so they don't realize that behind that phenotype, many times there are different stories, and they're powerful stories. And it's very hard sometimes to acknowledge, and many of us feel, particularly if you come from, different, a diverse background, to have a single identity, whether it's a religious color, even cultural. It is so hard to boil everything down to a sense of one aspect, rather than the multiple aspects that contribute to who we are as individuals. And it's very hard sometimes that, we simplify things that are very, very rich and complicated. And unfortunately, we have to celebrate all the components in our makeup of who we are as individuals. And we have to remember that sometimes when people want to boil that down to one single factor, that we should reject rejection and embrace the idea that we collectively have to not only tell our stories, but also acknowledge that we are not one single thing. So for those of us, all of us in the audience, we are a collection of many, many cultures, religion, and races. So this is a very powerful day in reminding us the beauty, but at the same time keeping this alive, not just as an event, but rather as a commitment that this is a everyday opportunity. So on that note, I'm going to turn it over to...
Super quick photo of you and Commissioner.
Before we do the...
Is that moving on to Commissioner?
No, I wasn't moving to Commissioner
sorry.
first.
Apologies.
I was actually moving to Vice Chancellor. Okay. So we can just get this out of the way. Now we have Vice Chancellor with our executive session motion.
Thank you, Madam Chancellor. I move that the Board of Regents convene an executive session Monday, February 11th, today, at 3:45 to discuss personnel matters.
Thank you, Vice Chancellor. Do I have a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you. And before we turn it over to our commissioner, we're going to take a
30 seconds.
commercial 30-second break.
Okay, let's do this back.
That was a big mistake.
Okay, we're about to resume. And at this time, now we will be discussing the public release of the ESSA school and district accountability determinations, and we will turn the conversation over to Commissioner.
Thank you. Thank you, Chancellor. And I have Ira with me at the end of the table. As you know, we have this presentation which has been presented to you. We have the item that went out as well. And when we did the release, you also received that information, and a number of you have done follow-ups. So my plan would be, because I want you to have opportunities to discuss this, that we move through this quickly. If you have questions at the end, certainly we'll respond. And then in the March meeting, come back and give you some more information about how we're doing our implementation and rollout to support schools across the state. So I'm going to move on to the second slide quickly. The engagement process, I think, as you know, was very comprehensive. Many of you participated in public conversations. We had hearings. And on top of that, we had a number of settings where, for the full day workshop, you had the opportunity of working with Linda Darling-Hammond, Scott Marion, and others who were brought in to give us feedback. And as we were developing this, of course, we were out across the state. Over 200 meetings were held. I think as a result of the work that you've identified, and we have all really committed to the concept that equity really needs to drive the decisions and the work that we're doing across the state with ESSA. If you think about that, how are we going to make sure that, in fact, there is equity? Well, certainly the support of educators is critical. Any disparities that exist in training needs to be identified and worked and supported. In terms of school, the concept of fiscal transparency. As you know, we have been working on the requirement under the ESSA plan for fiscal transparency, and working with a team from SED and other stakeholder groups to develop a plan which will really provide information for individuals within communities to look at how expenditures are spent by school, knowing that those districts should be in a position to really respond and be able to give the nuances of how that funding is being used. And then for our students, we heard long and hard the work that the regents want to be focused on, a well-rounded, culturally responsive and sustaining education for all our students. I think what we just saw in our presentation this morning underscored the importance of that. And so that is really the basis for the work that we're doing with ESSA. As you know, this is a new scoring or a new accountability system. As was part of our discussions for those 2 years, we talked about the fact that we wanted strategies that would be encouraged in districts to support equity and opportunity for students. And so some of the things, we have taken it off a very narrow approach of ELA and mathematics only, to look at ELA and mathematics and growth, to also add in science, and for our high school social studies, and also to look at those factors that we know are really critical. Absenteeism is extremely important, and then to look specifically at the work that is being done in districts to support our L students and our African American and Hispanic students as well. So I am now up to giving you an overview. I don't want to spend a lot of time this morning going through this, just to highlight a couple things. As you know, elementary and the middle schools were identified with specific categories of criteria that we were looking at. And in those criteria, it included English language learners, ELA and mathematics, as well as chronic absenteeism. If you go on to page 8, the identification of high schools, As you're aware, we had this conversation, the federal government required a 67% graduation rate as the bar upon which school districts must move. We have used that, but we've also identified within school and districts those categories, including the same things that we had for elementary and middle, but adding to that the college career readiness, including access to higher level coursework, access to CTE program, and then opportunities for dual enrollment that might come to schools, so that we made sure that the focus was on equity across the state and that it pushes the agenda for opportunity for students. I'm going to move forward. We have on page 9 is a review of identification examples, but we have a webinar on our website that goes through this very clearly and talks about how a school would become either a CSI or a TSI school, or how a district might be considered a target district. The next point I think is extremely important because it just lays out the categories. So you remember it was very clear that the regents did not want a single grade identified for any school. We've said that has been extremely detrimental to schools and districts across this nation when they have a designation that is, I believe, very it's one-dimensional. It doesn't really give them the opportunity to look at multiple things related to the accountability system. So with the regents and the work that we did in our workshops, we developed a 1 through 4 accountability indicator level. From that, a district could become a target district, and that could be that they have comprehensive support and improvement schools or targeted support and improvement schools in their district. Or a district could be good standing, which means that they have schools that are in good standing in their districts. The number of schools, and I want to point this out because I think that it really puts a number to realizing the schools that we're talking about. You actually have 370 schools that have any designation in the state, but that is out of 4,725 schools. So it's 370 out of 4,725. And there's 106 target districts. Those would be districts that have either the comprehensive support and improvement schools or the targeted support and improvement schools, or some subgroup within that district might not be identified in a school necessarily, is not doing well compared to that subgroup across the state. Target districts. We have, and I just pointed out to you, TSI or CSI schools within the district. 10 districts are identified because the district was in focus status, and when the student population was looked at as a whole, it met the criteria for CSI or TSI. We go on to look at required target district interventions, and some of you have asked about specific things that we're doing with those districts. That's what I'd like to give you an overview for in the next meeting that we have in March, because we can then talk to you about interventions and supports that we have. But if anyone gets hears anything from a district and you have a question about it, please feel free to call myself or to Joan, and we'll talk with you about how that particular district, how it falls into the category, and what would be required for that district. You had a question, Wade?
In preparation for that presentation, Commissioner, if you could just have a slide or two on the schools on the other end of the spectrum.
Sure.
That roughly 10% of highly performing schools by the system, and what the features are that have them performing differently than the schools in the norm, or these roughly 300 schools would be helpful.
Great. In our CSI schools, I'm on 14 now, 5% of the schools are identified as CSI schools. That's a requirement under the federal ESSA plan. They are 238 public schools and 7 charter schools. So they performed at level 1 on a combination of indicators, or for high schools, they don't have a 4-year cohort graduation rate, or they have a 4-year graduation rate of less than 67 and do not have 5 or 6-year cohort rates of 67%. So remember, one of the things we heard across the state, and I know several of you commented to me on this, high schools have been for years upset that if they had a student that didn't make it in June of their high school year, then it counted against them, even though the student may have stayed for a summer program and they had the opportunity to move forward, or they stayed even longer in the case of our ELL students, and they didn't count. And so we've made that a very conscious change in our plan. And as we've gone across the state and talked about that, our districts are pleased that in fact now they have the opportunity to be seen over a period of time working with students. The required CSI interventions, I'm going to leave that for some of our discussion next time, but we are working to make sure. I was with PTA last night and with school boards last night, and in our discussion of this, I made it clear community involvement in plans is important, and that parents need to be part of these solutions in schools. And so many individuals across the state, I know I can remember when we were in Buffalo, Catherine, the hearing that you had, there was a major group of community members there that said, we want to be part of the solution. Yes?
And not to prolong it. However, in the city that many of us come from, unlike other districts that have an accountability structure, they have school boards, et cetera, that doesn't exist in New York City, and unfortunately, within the 32 districts, there's a degree of involvement. There's some places where there's lots of involvement. There are other places where there's no involvement. And what the parents say is that they have no recourse because locally there's no board, there's no group that has the authority to do anything. And so I just think on that note, when it comes to New York City, there needs to be we need to have a specific strategy to ensure that parents have actual input.
So I would agree. I had this conversation this morning with Regent Mead about some of the differences that exist in New York City that we don't see in other places, and sometimes information is not shared or made available to the extent that it is in other places. So that's, I think, a very important point to bring back to you in March, given the fact we have meetings. We had a meeting scheduled last week with the chancellor, and it was canceled, but we will have a meeting and talk about that particular issue and how we can be assured that there is parent involvement in the plans that are being developed.
Can we just hold off just to finish the presentation, so this way we can kind of have a flow at the end, so Commissioner.
All right, so I'm on 16 for TSI schools, and I want to really make this connection of TSI schools to the concept of equity. So too often we have, all of us, worked with schools and districts that a population of students, whether it was in the African American students, Hispanic students, the L students, they got hidden in the data. TSI schools here in New York really, this holds out a school that is not doing what needs to happen with a particular subgroup. And that subgroup is identified as performing at level 1 in a combination of the new indicators here, so that you can say, well, we do have TSI schools, and when you look at the data, we aren't allowing a student to get lost in that data. And I think this is an extremely important point to bring it back to the equity, because we need to know where that's occurring. And I will say to you, one of the other things that we've helped districts to see is they may have schools that, because of their data this year, If they don't make some improvements, their next year data would indicate that they would be a TSI school. So we have told districts, here's your data, you need to be looking at what's happening so that you can do interventions. The interventions are on the next page, 17. And then on page 19, we address the issue of test refusal specifically. No school is identified solely because of high rates of test refusals, and only schools that meet all 6 of their criteria that are on that page, all 6, would be required to do a participation rate improvement plan. So I think it's important to understand that we listened and you listened as we got feedback on our plan, and we made those changes to make it be a very, what we anticipate as being a very small group that would even have to address the idea of a test participation plan. Our next steps, we received $80 million in Title I money for school improvement activities. Each identified district and school will receive Title I school improvement funds to support required activities. Those activities would include a needs assessment. So what caused us to be in a position where we have the data that we're looking at, and it's putting us in a position of being identified? What professional learning do we need to have put in place and support in our district? What improvement plan development might need to occur, and that would include our community involvement and other improvement activities that are designated by us at NYSED, or as we're working with districts, many of them will be working with their district superintendents, and in the case of New York City and other large city school districts, with us, to determine what activities are really important for them to see that have been successful. I did mention in there that the community and parent engagement in developing school, district and school improvement plans is critical to this. So we'll be expecting, as that funding goes out, that we underscore the importance of that. And the next steps is now, as we're working on this, we had meetings that were held here in Albany. They were all, the days of the meetings were differentiated. So some days were meetings for a targeted district. Some were for schools that were in receivership. We still have schools in receivership. And then other days were for other groups. So if somebody felt like, well, I had 4 days of training, it wasn't 4 days of training for a school necessarily. It was differentiated, so the days used, they were in sequence, but they were differentiated. And so the key milestones in all of the activities as we move forward, it'll be the implementation of the work with our teams out in schools, supporting them. And as I said, we will bring back an update on where we are on the implementation at the March meeting.
Thank you, Commissioner. We have Nan Mead first. Then I have Regent Cashin, Regent Johnson, Regent Collins, Regent Tillis. Anybody else I left out? Okay. Up. Regent Midler.
Okay. Thank you, Chancellor. So over the course of the last, couple of weeks, since the lists have come out, and in looking at the schools, specifically my JD, I think I've made several observations, and I want to share concerns with regard to those observations. So there are schools that have a high percentage of students with IEPs. I spoke to a school leader this morning. I think about 60% of the students in that particular school have IEPs. I think that schools with high rates of opt-out have ended up on these lists. And high schools where students are looking to credit recovery, right? So they're overage, they're undercredited, it may take them longer than the 4 years, and the graduation path is unclear. And I just, my concern is when we went into this plan, it was with the idea of support and not a negative connotation to the designation. I think a lot of folks around the table shared that sentiment, and I'm deeply concerned that we have sort of come back to that. The other thing I'll say is that the way in which the formula is laid out, I had to try and explain this to parents, right? Who, first of all, to Regent Young's point, had really not received direction from their district as to the implications of these designations before the list came out. But secondly, it's challenging to discuss this with parents in plain English. It's fine for us to sit around this table and go through it, but to explain this to parents has been challenging. So I just want to kick that off. I'm sure others have comments, but those are my concerns.
So if I could just respond to a couple things. We had meetings around the state where this isn't normally done, but I required superintendents to attend those meetings. We took attendance on those superintendents, and then we went back, if they were unable to do it, to ask their district superintendents to get with them. So we went through all of this. We actually gave them data from their school districts so they could understand it. I will say in the city we had 3 meetings. I personally was at one of the meetings, and they were pretty much all day, weren't they, Ira?
They were, one of them was a day and a half and 2 of them were 1 day.
Ira, I can't hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. One of them was for a day and a half and 2 of them were 1-day meetings. They were differentiated by elementary, middle versus high school.
Right. And so in those, in the meetings, I had asked that all of the superintendents be aware that the meetings were being held and that they come so that they, in their structure, could explain to all of their principals exactly how the system worked. And there were 2 superintendents that came out of 37. And
so was that like a big empty room? I mean, what did that look like?
No, it was filled. No, actually, the room was filled with representatives from districts, and they might have been their accountability people or whatever. But I think one of the things that is really important that we have stressed in every one of these meetings is that when you are the superintendent, that the people that need to understand how this system works are the principals, and so. Our district superintendents have had meetings not only with their superintendents but with their principals so they could understand it, and that we've asked the superintendents if they need more help, that we'd be willing to work with them, and that in fact they need to understand it so that it is something that they can explain to the people that work with them. So we do have some issues with communication, I think, that we have to identify, and I think we are starting to make this shift. But I would say to you that of those meetings, when you don't have people show up, I think it's the responsibility of the districts to make sure that this information gets distributed. And we're going to make sure that, in fact, that the importance of that gets shared. On your issue that you brought up, that schools who had high opt-outs were the schools that are in here, there are 14 total schools across the state that had less than 20% opt-out. Of those 14, 10 of them are good standing. 1 of them is TSI, and 3 of them are CSI. So we have a full breakdown. I think we shared that with you. We sent it out so you could understand that the differentiation is not, there is not a category here that says if you have a high opt-out rate, you're a CSI school or a TSI school. It is a number of factors, and as a side contributing, it could possibly affect it, but if you look at what the data that I just showed you, that isn't, it isn't clear at all that would be something that would put you in the list.
It's not, but I you know, as I said in my email in response to that, the fact that 4 out of the 10 schools with less than 20% participation rate were on that list, I found interesting.
So I guess my alternate would be, if you have a high opt-out rate, you automatically aren't accountable for kids in your school.
No, I'm just.
That's how.
No, that's not what I'm suggesting. But what I am, but it is interesting. That's why I tried to use the word interesting. That 4 out of those 10 schools were on that list, and yes, it's a small sample size. But as the sample size becomes bigger, and as the participation rate becomes higher, a smaller percentage of the schools are on those lists. And so I think it's at least worth looking at and having a conversation around that. Because to me, it's very, to me, it's an interesting observation. And I will leave it there.
Okay.
Can I just make one point of clarification?
Yeah, sure.
CDOS, not counted in the graduation rates, but it is counted in the college and career, or the career readiness index part of the formula?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Regent Cashin?
Thank you, Chancellor. So, maybe you've already done this, Commissioner, and you've done so much work, and so has your staff, so we're so grateful. But I know if I were looking at this comprehensive school improvement, schools are required too, I'd be dying. Already, need work. And then I have to do a needs assessment, I have to do, conduct surveys, this, that, and the other thing. So I think the more options that you spell out, if I may give a suggestion, concrete options. First of all, anyone in these categories may be reduction in class size immediately. And then spell out options for PD immediately. Maybe have people work with them. Because if a school's in a bad state, if a school, depending on the degree of it, it's like, I remember Race to the Top, we had to write all these grants. I remember thinking the needier schools, the needier districts, are gonna have a hard time with this. And they won't get the money.
That's right.
So all I'm suggesting for you to think about, all the work you've done, spelling out options is the better approach with needier, maybe somewhat, if not very unsuccessful school. Spelling out options is a critical dimension that could really help. Because if they have to come up with this themselves and they're already feeling miserable that they're in this condition and they're already worried about their future and their jobs, spelling it out with supports. What kind of PD would be the best PD? How are you going to do it? What's good for your school? Do you have staff? Could anybody work with them to come up with their plan? Tailor make it with certain things that are mandated, like absolutely mandated PD. New teachers in the school need to get extensive more support. Somehow figure out a way to do that. And then I think research does say reduction in class size and having a smaller group in front of you produces great academic progress. So, to summarize, spelling out options rather than having them come up with themselves, Commissioner.
Right.
And then having people tailor make it mandated PD, a really extensive PD, and more so even supports for the newer teachers. Because one dimension, I think, when we look at teachers, and we've discussed this so much with teachers and substitutes and all of our worries, one dimension we have to really start thinking of is what is the school doing, not just the college, but the receiving school who gets these new teachers, student teachers, etc. Are there certain protocols we could develop where they have to be supported in a certain way, almost trying to make it like they can't fail? We always put I think, at least in my experience over the last several years, we put the emphasis on those graduate schools. They've got to do this. They have to. They know it, and they're doing it. But the receiving schools, they should have a protocol on receiving schools. What do we do to make it so, if possible, that student doesn't fail? So spelling out is critical.
So we do have teams that are working with schools, and I think your point is well taken, that we have some successful strategies that work in our schools across the state. And those are the things that we're using as examples of ways that they can improve. And I think that point that was brought out earlier that Regent Norwood said, what is the other side, the other end of this spectrum doing to be successful? And those are the activities that are part of the team's options with schools.
Because I remember, I'm telling you to remember, you remember, I'm sure. But the needier the school or district is, the more support, the more choices that are spelled out, it would make it better for them if they could pick choices and get recommendations of experts as opposed to letting them develop everything on their own when they haven't demonstrated success.
Got it.
It's going to be key in Rochester.
Yeah. Commissioner, I would just suggest to the issue that Regent Cashin has raised, when you say you have these strategies, these successful strategies, is that, you know, a lot of times we talk about successful strategies, but you almost have to sometimes, you know, as doctors do, you may have a successful particular medication, but you have to diagnose the patient first and make sure that that medication is the perfect medication for that particular situation. Because part of it is knowing that you have a large group, as she said, of special needs, English language learners. You and I have already talked about the transient population with the issue of, you know, group, not group home, but students that live in shelters, and then couple that with possibly a small N and a small a varied distribution, because if you have a homogeneous group, your N is not going to be impacted. But if you have a diverse N group, as you and I have talked about, you know, you have some 1s, some 2s, some 3s, some 4s, that's going to have a different outcome than a group that, even if the 20% is a sampling of the big population and it's consistent, it's going to stay consistent. It's not going to vary. So I would suggest, as you go through some of these identify good models, that those good models align themselves with the root cause or the understanding of what is going on in those buildings, because sometimes we blame the school, not realizing that how do you come out of a situation 60% special ed, 30% ELs, poverty, transient population, poverty on top of everything else. All of these issues may need a whole different approach than having these models that sometimes we think, just like, you know, using the models that we use for identification. Sometimes, you know, some people would call some of those models not the most scientific approach to identification. So I would suggest that as we take the models that are successful, that we make sure that we align those with the specific needs in those specific schools. Because you and I know, otherwise you're flying 35,000 feet in the air, and you may sprinkle some stuff on the school,
and I
but
do
not
think it's
get it
important,
solved.
the whole concept of looking at the data, but then a needs assessment gets to those underlying causes. And we had that conversation about a school that is serving a very high population of homeless children adjacent to a homeless shelter, and the movement of those children. So we're going to be looking at things like the absentee rate and see how that falls out relative to this system. So, I mean, listen, there's no system perfect here. I mean, I think we have to identify, we put a system in place, we all worked very hard. We had national experts give us feedback. We put something in place that really is more focused on support. But I think we can all recognize that we need to have some looks at some of the things that are ramifications of the system we put in place.
Right. And as Linda Darling-Hammond was sitting over here, I remember her saying, make sure that the resources and that the funding is targeted to the right places, because other than that, I think we're spreading out limited staff limited resources, in some cases to places that in fact may not be, we may be identifying places that in fact are going to draw funding from places that we know are truly targeted or need the targeted or the comprehensive assistance, because some of the issues I think is that in looking at some of the list, there are places that people have concerns whether in fact those are the right individuals on the bus. Regent Johnson?
I'm not quite sure where to start. So I'll start with saying that asking superintendents mid-year to cease what they're doing or to suspend it in order to respond to the data that has just arrived at their desk is a bit challenging for superintendents. I would suggest that for most of the schools, not all of them, for most of the schools on this list, this is not new news. Not at all. So here it arrives again, minus some really important information. And I sent a list of questions, and I don't want to repeat them all here, but I would request in the future as we go forward, when any one of us raises a set of questions around a proposal, that we be given the courtesy of an answer, so we don't have to wait until we have a regents meeting to pose them all. And if we can't answer them, at least say we've received your question and we'll get answers back to you as soon as possible, because it's pretty frustrating to have conversations with superintendents and not be able to get back to them and say, here's what I've learned. So, not new news. These are poorly resourced schools. I wonder whether or not we actually have the research data to help them figure out how to work differently with their students. The presentations always give us these composite scores. These composite scores are outcomes. They're not recommendations or research findings about how you change what happens in schools. So I would ask that we have a presentation in March. What research findings do we have that we can share with districts based on different profiles, because schools have different profiles, that can help them move this forward? I would suggest that I'm not quite sure what the goal is here, but I would hope the goal is to close or narrow the achievement gap and to improve the quality of education for all of our students, but I can't tell by looking at these indicators. And the last comment that I have is that I would like to know, are these factors that lead to the rating reliable and valid? If you were to apply them over and over again, would the same results come across the country? How do we decide that this is indeed the correct array of factors? So many of these districts bring different profiles to their district. We have districts that have large percentages of students who enter with interrupted educational experiences. They can be highly successful. They're not going to fit this profile. So because I suddenly have a large influx of these children in my school district, I'm now labeled instead of helped to figure out how do we work differently with those children. And the same thing with the graduation rate. If I've not had a school experience since the age of 8, and now I enter high school at the age of 14, the likelihood of graduating in 4 years is pretty limited, unless we learn from research how to educate them differently. I don't see the research conversations at all. If we're a policy-making board, for me, it is as important to understand what we are learning about how we educate students as it is about labeling the school districts. And we spend our time labeling school districts, but I don't see us spending our time on what can we learn about how to educate all of our children to higher standards than we currently have. So those are my comments.
Very good ones.
Thank you, Regent Johnson. Regent Collins?
I'm not even going to get an answer.
Along the same line that you mentioned earlier, I am wholeheartedly in support of the ESSA planning and the planning process that we've gone through. What I'd like to see is some way of giving us not a very complicated formula, but one that's going to tell me and the folks back in Western New York and Buffalo how we're going to make sure that $80 million is distributed to the most needy schools, because we can drill down, I think, through the ESSA planning process for each district. The classrooms, the cohort of students that need special attention and additional money, including the parents and the teachers. When are we going to get something that tells me how we're going to spend that $80 million on these children that are in these TSI and CSI schools? There has to be some way of assuring my schools in my district and throughout the whole state that the money that we have is going to the most needy kids. I don't see that in here. We talked about allocation of funds. How do we get to allocate funds to schools, like you mentioned, a school that's next door to a homeless shelter? How do we make sure that the monies that they get is what they need? There has to be a formula somewhere. If there isn't, we need to start working on one, and one that is a simplification, not with all these designations, but just say that in schools 75, there's 6 classrooms that need X number of dollars, and their teachers need X number of dollars to make sure that they know how to handle those students and that curriculum. I just want to see some way of assuring us that the $80 million is going to the kids that the ESSA plan is saying that it should go to.
So we'll provide the distribution of funds for you, and as you know, the work that we're doing on financial transparency will then mirror the money that goes in the district to those schools. And then in your communities, there'll be an opportunity to talk through how are expenditures in that district distributed as well.
Because I keep telling my parents group, everyone that I meet with, is look at the district's plan, what they're submitting, because I have people there who are very concerned that some of the schools are getting more resources than others, and they're also getting additional funds that's coming in through grant programs. So if they're getting grant programs, other grant programs besides the $80 million, we need to take that into account too. And I'm hoping that we do that. I just want to make sure that we are getting the money to the most needy of the kids in our CSI and TSI schools.
Let me just, thank you, Regent Tom.
Okay.
Let me just, as I'm looking around, if you've already spoken, just in terms of Robert's rules, then I'm just adding you to the next after, okay, just, it's not that I'm ignoring, just want to make sure that if you have not spoken, then I'm going to put somebody else ahead, so, and that includes Regent Reyes, since you have not spoken, so I'll add you to not quite the bottom, but close to the other people that have not spoken yet. But to Regent Collins, that I think that is one of the core issues, this whole issue of funding, and how do you, the transparency of seeing the dollars, and that these dollars are in fact going to where they need to go and are showing up, and that we can actually point to that and say those dollars are being used for, and there's evidence to that effect. That is a huge concern that many advocates and many groups have raised in terms of the funding. So I just want to thank you for raising that issue. Next we have, Regent Tillis, you're next, and then I have Midler, Young, Regent Reyes, and then I have Cashin, who already spoke, and then I have Regent Mead, and then I think I have everybody, and we will conclude. Oh, sorry.
I just want to be on the list.
Oh, absolutely. So after Regent Reyes, I'm going to put Regent Finn. I'm going to put you ahead of Regent Cashin.
She's not here to hear it. That's going to be a fight.
Okay. Okay, we will conclude with Regent Mead. All right, so now we have Regent Tillis.
Okay, a couple of issues. I'm concerned in some of the districts that need the money the most, and need the resources the most, the money might go to the district and even might go to a school. How do we make sure that it's being spent wisely, or how do we channel how that money's being spent? Because we have districts on the island, if you put money into them, the money will just go out the other side and not necessarily go for the kids. And I don't know how we can do that, but I hope that we are somehow not just monitoring, but taking some hold of that. Secondly, in regard to Nan's interesting thoughts, I have a good concern, a bad concern, because I have to try to explain to our districts, virtually every one of whom is over the 95 or didn't hit the 95%, that I think we try, unless I'm wrong, USDOE requires the 95%.
Yes, that is true.
And that we, in the ESSA plan, tried to mitigate as much as we could against using that as the be-all and end-all figure. And that's why we pushed it out 1 year and then the next year, and you have to do a report, and there are no monetary consequences, but there are consequences to being put on a list. As many of our superintendents have told me, in terms of how the district is looked upon internally by their own people, real estate and otherwise. I don't care about real estate that much, but it is very, very true. At least on Long Island, that's what our districts are. So a consequence is more than just a financial penalty or whatever. That's just a comment. The last question is, we're talking about some of the factors on the high school level that are factored into this are advanced placement courses, for instance.
Right.
I have been looking, and I know Newsday did a very good column on it. We have districts on Long Island that have no advanced placement courses, so the equity is not available for those kids. Now, I don't know how we push districts to have an AP course that don't have any. But secondly, what bothers me even more is that some districts which have AP courses wait until about half year, about till now, and then tell the kids, by the way, you have to pay $89 to take the test. And if you're not going to, and that could be 2 or 3 tests, so it could be $200-300. And that if they don't sign up for the test now, they will take them out of the AP course mid-year. And I think we need to examine how, if we're going to include it as an equity factor, and our kids are not being treated equitably, that we have to figure out how to do this. If the state comes in with AP money to help kids pay for the tests that can't afford the test, or else we shouldn't factor it in as an equity item. I have the same issue that we're talking about in terms of art pathway to graduation, when certain things aren't available to a lot of kids. So just comments.
Just as in response to that, there is part of the governor's budget was a allocation specifically to identify for students who are at risk to pay for the AP costs in schools. You may remember that we used to have a federal program that picked up a substantial amount of that. It was withdrawn 2 years ago, so that no longer exists as a source of funding. And so we're hoping that New York picks that up. The governor has it in his budget, and we have asked for an expansion beyond the governor's budget. So that issue is an issue for us.
We also did get in touch, because some people did get in touch with us about the whole AP, and there was a conversation with some of the district people that were asking students to pay or be, so that's but again, the resource issue is key, because if you do not provide students with certain opportunities, it's almost like, how do you talk about equity when you're not providing it? therefore, it's not that the students don't want to take advantage of, it's that it's not provided. So these are some of the issues and concerns that I think we're tackling in terms of what the dollars look like, how are they being used, or in some cases misused, and how do we create a true, it's not so much, and I think Commissioner and I have had this conversation, I think when we use the umbrella of accountability, a lot of times we lose our way because of the fact that while we're trying to hold somebody, with an inventory or checklist, it's deeper than that. We really have to go so much deeper than just, checklists. Okay, so you have A, you have B, you have C. It's much more who has access to those classes, right? So just because you say you have an AP class, and then you don't dig in deeper and say, well, who's in those classes? And then you wonder why the gap continues to widen if in fact you continue to provide those classes for some students, but you don't create conditions for access for all students. So anyway, next one is Regent Midler.
Hello from this end of the world.
That's the northern part of the state.
Of the middle.
Much of what I was concerned about has been very clearly expressed by my colleagues, so I'm going to go. I really support what they've said, but I'm not going to repeat it. I'm going to go for some other issues that are not clear to me. One of them is we talk about subgroups, and how do we look at poverty or economics? It's not really a subgroup in and of itself, and yet many of the factors that surround poverty cause other or are part of the problem, so medical care and food and so on. So when you have, let's take for example a very rural community where most of the people are self-employed farmers, dairy, etc. They often don't have a lot of financial support, but they're rich in the fact that they have their own income, can provide their own food, but it's a different kind of situation. Very often these students are not taking the exams. I know we don't go on an agrarian calendar, but they stay home to work or do other things, or they just choose not to take the exams. And I don't know how we discriminate or send funds where it's needed. Also in some of these small or very rural schools, the parent participation and information is not at the same level as inner city or higher income areas because these parents are involved or working or can't get to school. And many of them don't have higher level degrees and therefore feel put off. So I really do think we have to look at not only what we say, but how we say it and who we say it to. Remember, different people learn differently. Some have to hear it, some have to read it. So that's another one, which is reading levels, unfortunately, are lower, and often this is a problem. Another issue I'm concerned about is the professional development itself. In some of these smaller districts, not only do we have problems finding subs, but we have trouble finding the actual professional development. Now, the BOCES provides a great deal, but many of these districts are living on a shoestring and don't have the funds to release the teachers or can't find the subs to cover for the teachers. So we have to look at how we could share these opportunities or combine. This is a real problem because the professional development doesn't always address the specific need in a very small district. So these are all things in ESSA that I'm worried about. When we identify resource inequities, we have to take a look at the question which we've discussed before between equities and equality. I still remember the picture. I think it was, I like that. You had three boys standing at a fence. One was tall, one was middle, and then you say if it's equal, they each get the same crate, which doesn't help the little guy see over the fence. If it's equitable, one boy gets one crate, one gets two, the other one gets none, and you look at equitable because now they can all see the field. So that has an image to me. I don't know how one does that with finances. I agree with people who say we give money and then sometimes there's an emergency, and a school board has to take that funding and put it someplace else. But we're doing an injustice to the children who then think they're failing and opt out of the test because they don't think they can make it. So the idea that we're supportive and not punitive is excellent. I don't think we're there yet, but I think it's a good place to go. And I didn't know whether variances are available for different schools based on when we look at the economic factor. I don't know how a school applies for a variance or applies for assistance without getting tagged. On page 19, where you talk about 6 criteria, that's on the participation rate. You know, if you fail to meet the 95%, all of those go back. So if you didn't improve between 16 and 17 as a year, school year, sometimes that's a challenge. I can't go backwards. Now, there may be many reasons for that, but I really don't know that we shouldn't draw a line in some from now on, as opposed to what used to be. It's just a question whether that would feel more positive or give me a better chance to address the issue. Because participation is increasing, but I can't go backwards. So that's another one. And I'm going to contact the BOCES district superintendents to see what they're doing to work together. I'm sure you've done it, but I don't know. So I'm going to go ask to see whether or not I can help facilitate people talking to each other. So if you have a district that's really small, like DeRuyter, with 87 staff members, and that's it, it's really tough. They're having a tough time. And because of a charter school that's going to open, they may not even be able to stay open. And I want people in the area to have the choice to have a local school. So we'll see whether there's anywhere around that they can do that. Thank you.
If we can, we are way behind schedule and we have an incredible day. So brevity is appreciated. Regent Young, Regent Reyes, Finn, and we'll end with me.
So, just a couple of comments. First, my colleague to my left talked about the readiness and capacity of districts to actually, schools and districts to actually do some of this, given the fact that they haven't. And I think that's a real problem, particularly in New York City. When you actually look at the data for specific districts, there are districts where the vast majority of students who took the exams in grades 3 through 8, the vast majority are performing at levels 1 and 2. In fact, in looking at the data, there appears to be something happening in grade 5. I don't know, I'm sure all people have looked at it. And what I worry about is that there are lots of people who haven't really focused on some of these real issues. And so there's something about the process that is event-oriented, and typically when you focus on an event, you come up with event solutions, right? So, you focus on the scores, let's do something about the scores. Well, the scores may not necessarily be the problem. There may be something else, but that's not how people interpret it. So I'm just going to underscore something. My colleague talked about options and choices. I actually think autonomy has to be earned. So I think that if there are model plans, see, I still don't understand conceptually this idea that we tell them to come up with a team and to write a plan and submit it to us and then execute the plan. We've been doing that for forever. And I just think that if someone has the idea, you have a plan, you have a model strategy, that we ought to be able to provide a bank of these, and that's what they should be selecting. That's number one. Number two, there are policies, practices, and structures that impact performance. For example, when my colleague says that there's a school that has 60% of the students See, I don't even understand why we allow that. The percentage of young people nationally with IEPs is what, 12%?
It's less than
It's
15%.
it's less than
Yeah.
15%.
Right.
And if you have 60, if there is a school with 60%, see, there's something else that's wrong.
That's right.
And no amount of team planning and professional development and all of that is going to address that. And so there ought to be, we ought to identify what are the policies that are being executed in districts that are resulting in the performance. That shouldn't be on the back of the school. The other are what I call structures. So when I look at the 3 through 8 data, it seems to suggest that there's a huge problem early on, right? So let's say third grade performance is not a third grade problem. You have to look at early childhood. However, and I'm just, again, I hate to pick on my city, but when I talk to superintendents and principals, and I say to them, well, where's your expertise around early childhood, early literacy? And they look at me and I say, well, do you have access to an early literacy specialist? And they say to me, that's not the way we're structured, Dr. Young. We have to do something else. We don't have a resident early childhood person. The superintendents don't have it, the principals don't have it. So my question is, then they're really working with both hands tied behind their back. There's structures in place that don't match the needs and what we know works. And so to me, they can't plan their way out of that. You know, if they don't have access to literacy specialists or math specialists that they can deploy as they see fit, then how do we reasonably expect improvement? So I think structures are important. And I also think that there are like practices that people engage in on a pretty regular basis that in some cases these practices result in improved performance. In other cases, these practices result in low performance. And in many of the cases when they result in improving performance, it's not because they're smarter. It's because they have the will to do what's right. And I'm just going to say, you know, there are things that we know. We know, for example, that the use of time and the amount of time that students are engaged actively in instruction has an impact on performance. We know when you go in and out of these schools that many schools have practices where they don't use time effectively. They just don't do it. And so for me, the question becomes, how do you get them to, what is it that we do that will get them to do the right thing? And the final piece, and I think it gets at something my other colleague said, Johnson, about the business of research. Here's I understand our challenge. We don't have a research arm. Years ago, we had a research arm. We do not have a research arm. However, I think we do have the capacity to begin to identify the places that are making significant progress. We do have that capacity. There are schools where young people have the same demographics that are associated with failure, yet those schools are succeeding. And I believe that we ought to begin to identify where they are, and then look at them and look and see exactly what they're doing. You know, where are the schools that are making progress with overage undercredited students? They exist. It's not that they don't exist. So what are they doing? And then how do we share that information? Because I think those are things that we can actually do.
Thank you. Regent Reyes?
I basically have a question going back to the system for identifying and selecting schools and school districts for CSI, TSI. And the question is, why, if a school has a very high opt-out rate, that while that's not the only thing that gets counted and it's not a reason in and of itself to be put on the list, it counts for 1 or 0, I forget, in the calculations of looking at other elements when you're combining it with growth score. Why, if a school is a high-performing school and is a low participating school, why would their scores be affected by that low participation, such that a 1 or a 0 eventually gets them to be put on a CSI, TSI in the combinations with other factors? And it seems like an albatross on around their neck.
Okay, I think.
And I'm looking for an answer.
Yeah, I think.
Meaning, what?
Yeah, I think.
I tried last time. I said, is it justified? You know, how do you justify? And so I'm asking, what's the justification for lowering the score and having this ripple effect with the other elements because of that low score? Which is another way of saying you opt out, you're not forced to participate, but if you opt out, you lose.
So I did bring that up earlier, Regent Reyes, but I think it's important to know there is no factor that says if you're an opt-out, high opt-out school, you're automatically named. So just so we all understand, that's not the factor. And when individuals say high opt-out schools are automatically on the list, that's not the case.
I didn't say that.
I'm just pointing out there's a lot of different nuances to this question. And in fact, if you had less than 20% of the students taking the assessment, there were a total of 14 schools in that category, and 10 of them were in good standing. One of them was a TSI school and one was a CSI school, but it isn't only the factor of an opt-out, although I said, and we talked last time, and we'll bring it up again in March, that it could affect it. It is not the factor that puts you on the list. It is other things as well. And because we have multiple indicators in the system, that's why it's not as, it isn't something that automatically puts you anywhere.
If I restate the question by asking, what would be the effect and difference if schools with high opt-out that are high performing, for the kids who were opted out, that they got an average score of that school and not anything other than that, what effect would that have in terms of the numbers of those schools that would end up on TSI or CSI lists?
Well, as we've talked a number of times, we are required to factor in the fact that 95% is actually required for participation by the federal government. So we can't count students on any other assessments. We have to, in fact, factor in, and which is why we did the different approaches that we did to try to keep that and mitigate that issue as much as possible. But it is a reality that we have to factor in and not just count students as a different performance level if we don't have the data on them.
Is that, I think, Commissioner, I think for next month, what may be helpful, because I'm hearing his question slightly different, but I think what I'm hearing Regent Reyes say, yes, the feds require the 95%. The state gives the parents the right to opt out. So there's tension, there's a disagreement.
That's right.
And we know there's a disagreement, but given the disagreement, we don't close that gap, because in essence we honor the federal requirement and we factor it. So by factoring it, what we end up doing is, I think what he's saying is, once you count it in, it's going to have it could, doesn't have to, but it could have an impact, especially if it's a borderline situation. If the distributions are 1, 2, 3, 4, it's going to have if it's more homogeneous, it may not. So I think anytime you count something, it could potentially have an impact. You know, some people would argue the same thing about growth. Once you factor growth, which people have argued whether it's value, there's validity or not, once again, it could have. So I think what I'm hearing is having Regent Reyes say, the fact that you factor it in and you have a distribution of an N of 1, 2, 3, 4, you then could see an impact as a result of using it.
Right.
Okay. Regent Finn and then Regent Mead for the landing.
The best thing I can do to help now is give back my time.
Thank you. All right, Regent Finn, and we will make it up to you.
Rewards.
Regent Mead?
All right, I'll try and be quick. Just to respond briefly to Regent Young's comment regarding schools that have large percentages of students with IEPs. That is, I agree with him, that is its own issue. It's also an issue, actually, the school leader I spoke with this morning that has that makeup in his school. It is the mission of the school to serve that population. So that's that's a slightly different challenge than the challenge of how do schools end up with the high percentage, right? Specifically with regard to charter schools, how are those schools on these lists going to receive support? And does it matter who the authorizer is? So if it's the regents, if it's the DOE, if it's SUNY. The other thing I wanted to just point out as well is that charter schools that backfill may also be, penalized, strong word, I get it, but if they are only given a certain number of years to work with a particular student and they don't make that graduation rate, that negatively impacts their graduation rate. And again, if there's a mission of the school where they're working with that population, that's another challenge to consider. But more specifically, I wanted to know how charter schools are receiving support, either from the department or locally in their district.
So yes, you're absolutely right, Regent Mead. We had, I think, 8, is it, Ira? 8 charter schools that were on the list, and we will be giving them support through our charter office. And your other question that relates to that, is that different depending on the authorizer? And yes, it is. Charter schools fall under the accountability system, but we're in charge, if you will, of the ones that are regent chartered. We have New York City that has a couple, I think, and we have Buffalo that has a couple, and then the others, and a substantial number, are from SUNY. And they're fully aware of our accountability system, and so I'm sure that they will be working with their charters, but it's their responsibility.
How many are from SUNY versus the number that are in the SCD?
I don't want to quote it perfectly, but it is a substantial number. We'll get it to you. We'll send it to all of you so you're aware.
SUNY is a larger number for sure.
Much
Yeah.
larger.
It's about 200, isn't it?
So I think we will reconvene in, I'm sorry? P12. Let's remember that we're going to continue this conversation, part 2, phase 2, next month. And one of the things that I think is key is that we all have examples of outliers or issues that have happened. I'm kind of sitting here thinking of District 1 in Regent Mead's district that took on a whole project with integration, and as a result, that school has now been identified. So, so I think we, as the commissioner knows, we are looking at many of these situations that need to be revisited because of the fact that what are the other underlying issues that are creating the identification process as part of the
And one thing
ESSA?
I meant to say, Chancellor, if any of you receive a call from a school and you would like to have an analysis of that school and understand how they got on the list and what the factors are. I mean, we all know there could be population. We've talked about a lot of things. We will, if you'd let us know, then we will do a review for you so that you can hear and see what it is that contributed to that school's being placed on one, either a CSI, TSI, or a district getting a targeted district analysis.
Okay, we stand adjourned. Thank you.
Our rules on bail, 94.